You heard it this morning from a couple of speakers who talked about the fact that we're in a crisis when it comes to housing, and that's pretty true. The words housing and crisis go together a lot at the moment. And it certainly is the case that we have acute problems with rough sleepers. We have a situation where we have, for the first time in years, families that are homeless, who are being put into hubs, said to be a temporary solution, but you'd wonder how long that temporary solution will be a temporary solution before it becomes permanent, a bit like the oft-quoted income tax, which came as a temporary measure. And we also are putting people who should be in social housing into the private rental sector and subsidising their rents, and in some way we're crowding out people who would be in the private rental sector, who now have to pay more rent than they might have to if the government wasn't also competing for the space that they find in the private rental sector. And that's putting up rents, and that is also making it difficult for people to buy housing. And house prices have gone up, and when you do buy a house, you've got to borrow an enormous amount of money to do so, and house prices are increasing, and those factors are beginning to affect, I think as David Duffy said this morning, our competitiveness. And this is becoming a big problem for the state. So we certainly have a housing problem, and I think this is becoming a significant failure of public policy, and it's something that we need to think about a lot more deeply than we've done. I think the market system is not responding to the stimuli that normally market systems respond to. That's high prices, and I think there's a kind of a time to think about whether the policies we're pursuing are the correct ones. Now, there's two quotes there on the screen from Einstein. I'm not sure he ever said these things. When you go and try and source the origins of these quotes, you find that it's not quite true that he said them. But anyway, they encapsulate a couple of thoughts that are really kind of good when you start thinking about a problem. The first one is we cannot solve our problems with the thinking that we used when we got into those problems. And I think there's an element of that in our housing policy and our approach to housing in Ireland at the moment. And the second one is that if he was going to spend time trying to solve a problem, he'd spend, as he says there, 55 minutes of the hour analysing the problem and 5 minutes working on the solution. I suspect that what we've got to is a point where we spent an enormous amount of time on solutions, because we presuppose we know the problems, and that this is causing us a problem. So I think I'm going to just look back at housing history a little bit and see if we can draw any lessons from that. Now, in the 20th century, the experience of baby boomers, people my age and maybe a little bit older, was that they had secure employment and they had incomes, and those incomes throughout their life tended to grow with economic prosperity. And with secure employment and growing income, you were able to borrow money to buy a house over 20, 25 years with a great degree of confidence and pay it back. In addition, the government subsidised people to buy houses. They gave mortgage interest relief, those of you who remember that in the past, and they also gave very great big grants and subsidies, and I was the beneficiary of this myself at the time. And what that did was it increased the relative attractiveness of ownership relative to renting, and it allowed the majority of people to buy housing. And by 1980, it's quite clear now from the research we have that the subsidies we were given to homeowners in Ireland by 1980 were the most generous in Europe. Though it should be said also that there was a lot of subsidising of home ownership right around most other countries. We also had what's called the financialization of housing, which is kind of significant. Prior to the 1980s, you got mortgages from your building society, not from the banks. The banks were very reluctant to lend money for housing. And building societies essentially circulated money around the economy. They didn't create new money, or they hadn't access to funds. So after 1980, after the financial services revolution, the Big Bang and all that, banks started getting into this industry and they started lending money. But of course, the significant thing about banks, certainly in an economy as we had in the 1980s and 1990s when we had a currency of our own, banks can kind of create money. So it meant that there wasn't a shortage of finance, and it meant that, as happened with building societies periodically, there was just no money in the economy to fund housing, which effectively kept a cap on housing. But once the banks got into the business, they were able to loan more and more money. And one of the things that they did was they increased those ratios of income. And you found during that period that the the loan-to-income ratio went from, as it was in the 1970s, 2.5 times a single income plus subsidiary income to 3.5 times your joint income. And this allowed effectively a doubling in the size of mortgages. Now, if you listen to the central bank, they are very acutely aware of these, what they call now macroprudential rules, and they say that if we were to move from the current 3.5 up to 4, what would happen is that would get discounted into the value of houses, and it would shove up the price of houses. It would also make the banks a little bit less stable. And that's all very true, but if you think about that, you could reverse that and bring the loan-to-value ratios down to 3% or 3 times or even 2.5 times. And what effect would that have? Well, it might bring down the price of houses, because the price of houses are essentially driven by people competing against each other with the resources they have to buy the houses. So there's a question mark over there. So our policies really do end up with high house prices. And it's fair to say that increased credit drives property prices higher. And so if you look back on the history of housing, you see there was a step change, not only in Ireland, but in other countries. Once the system was financialised, house prices increased quite considerably. So the outcome of that for Ireland was that we have high house prices, and we have. Now, not across the country, and it's very important to bear in mind that if you look down through the DAF statistics, you can find parts of Ireland where there are very modest house prices, and by and large outside the urban areas house prices are not particularly high, but in urban areas we have a serious problem. By 1970, ownership of housing was about 61% in Ireland. We were an outlier then. You can see from that statistic there, the UK were about 50%, Sweden was about 35%. They've all caught up in the meantime. But by 2007, home ownership in Ireland peaked at about 80%. Which is really high and significantly high in European terms. So what we can draw from that is that we had what I would call there, and what I've called up there on that slide, the property ladder paradigm. With this idea that you enter into the market and you buy a house, and then eventually be able to buy a bigger house, and virtually anybody who wanted to could buy their own home, and that was the dominant thinking. And it also meant that we thought of prices of houses, that high house prices are a good thing and that they were needed to drive supply. Now, my point is, having thought about this over the last couple of years and why we are not now able to get the market to respond to high house prices, that this is the thinking of baby boomers, and maybe we need to go and think this out again and go and look at a different way of looking at things, that our policies, Rebuilding Ireland and the government solutions, they're all driven by this paradigm, and maybe the paradigm is wrong. Of course, home ownership solves many problems, and this is one of the reasons why we all like home ownership. It deals with what I call the 3 perils of renting. There's the lack of security of tenure, the lack of security about the cost of accommodation. Even if you sit back and think about yourself when you get to 65 and your income halves, your rent won't go down by half. And if you are spending 40% or 50% of your income on your rent and your income comes down by half, you're in trouble. And I think we are facing into that for people going out maybe 20, 30 years. And it's something the government aren't even thinking about. Also, the landlord is a hegemon in the sense that if you want to adopt your accommodation to fit your family needs as your family grows, well, you can't do that if you're in rental accommodation, because you've got to go back to them and ask the landlord, I want to paint the ceiling in the child's bedroom polka dot blue. Your landlord will say no. But if you own your own house, you can do it. So there's problems there with renting. Home ownership also offers, and it means for the middle and lower middle classes to accumulate wealth, to build a pot of money for themselves as they get to retirement. So when you get to retirement, if you own your own home, you need an income, but you don't need any income to pay rent. And that's a very important part of all of our psychology. So it's one of the reasons why home ownership is attractive. It is said that home ownership will lead to a more stable society. This was Margaret Thatcher's great mantra, of course, and therefore you will have better mantras. And the sociologists will tell you, yeah, there's something in all that. That people own their own homes, they have a stake in society, they have a sense of purpose about themselves, and that is all very good. But not everybody will be able to buy their own homes, and the model of high levels of home ownership have to come with a safety net. And the safety net we had during the 20th century was social housing. So for those who could not afford to buy from their own income, the government intervened and provided them with houses at low rents related to their incomes and with secure tenures, so they weren't asked to leave at the behest of their landlord. And also, given the fact that we had the home ownership paradigm, we always provided them with the possibility of being able to buy the house in the long run. And we had a lot of that. So this 20th century worldview was essentially that we can make home ownership affordable and accessible by borrowing more money. That high house prices are good. What we don't get in that, and we haven't got in this part of the world since the Second World War, is a causal link between high house prices and high land prices. Most people think that high land prices are a cause of high house prices. In fact, the market works the other way, that you have high land prices when you have high house prices. So high house prices drive high land prices. So if we drive up the price of houses by making money accessible to purchasers who compete among each other to buy the houses, eventually land prices will go up. And we also have the idea that if you have high land prices, land and new houses can be taxed to provide development levies to fund social housing through Part 5. All that structure that we've built into our system is a structure dependent on and driven by high house prices. I make a distinction between the cost of producing a house and the cost of building a house. The cost of building a house in Ireland is not significantly different than it is in other countries, but the cost of producing a house is. It's the cost of producing a house that the problem is, and the difference between those two is things like VAT, the provision of housing through Part 5 and development levies. And basically one of the things I would suggest to us all is we need to think about that, and we need to think about other ways of funding development and funding social housing, because the way it works at the moment is that it's a tax on new houses and the purchase of new houses. We also have an idea in our head that property investment is lucrative and that the private rented sector will be provided by the market. That's a worldview we have, born of experience, because if you have capital appreciation, people investing in the private rented sector buy to access that capital appreciation much more than they buy to access the current flow of income. So that home ownership mindset drives the idea that we will have a lucrative market there for the private sector to get involved in. So think about now. Where are we now? That was the past. Right. Government subsidies and incentives all reduced. The government were able to do that and maintain high house prices because the lending given to people by banks was allowed to increase. So effectively you got a situation where the subsidies and the interest relief was all removed, and borrowing replaced those, and house prices remained high. Unfortunately, we are now constraining that, and we should constrain it because it's a threat to our banks. People now are on contingent contracts, they have more precarious employment, and that very fact makes paying off a mortgage much more risky. If I borrow a lot of money for 30 years and we get to the next recession, which I'm sure Dave will tell us we will undoubtedly have, and you've got two incomes going into one house, there's a chance that, very good chance, that one or two of those incomes will come down by 10% or even more. Even in the secure public sector, we had that. So that could happen. And if one or other of the parties lose their job, well, now that couple who bought the house based on 3.5 times their income could be in trouble, and their house can be a risk. And if that goes on for a while, that's a serious problem. So essentially, borrowing money, as we did in the past, has become a riskier proposition than it was during the 80s and the 90s. And I think there's an understandable wariness out there about debt. I think the incoming generation have seen the generation before them get into trouble borrowing loads of money, and as a result of that, they're wary about taking on debt, and they are correct to be. So the context for our housing sector has changed. There's a question mark here, and it is mass home ownership a thing of the past? And will lower income households be able to finance house purchase? That's a fundamental question. And I think it's inevitable that more people will rent than before, and some people will never buy. The Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank in the UK, have done some research, and they've produced a bit of work recently, and they show that, they say, that 40% of millennials, as they call them, 40% of them will not buy before they're 40, and 30% of them will never buy at all. They'll be renters all of their life, and they will end up at the end of their lives, if their incomes come down and they haven't properly provided for their pensions, they will end up coming back on the state to be housed. So I think it is fair to say that the housing ladder is now only for the very well off, and we're into a situation where we have, as the phrase has it, a generation who will rent for more of their lives than was the case in the back end of the 20th century. The rental sector, they're going to rent in the rental sector. The assumption there that government have, a priori, is that the market will provide. And what I keep wondering about is, where is the economic analysis that says that is going to happen? The thinking assumes that property investment is lucrative, and it has been, but will it be in the future? And it seems to me that it is very unlikely that undercapitalised private investors will be able to supply that market without finance, for sure. May not be able to supply it anyway, but without finance they're not going to be able to supply it. So where do they get the finance? They get it from the banks. Now, if you went into a bank and said, I'm going to buy an income producing asset, and you give me 80% of, or even 60% of the cost of buying that asset, the bank manager will look at you and say, what asset are you going to buy? A house. No problem. Shares? No. They will not loan you money to buy an asset such as shares, or even government bonds, which are supposed to be very secure. But they will lend you money to buy houses. But as any businessman knows, that gearing makes any investment risky. And it's that dynamic that results in people, when they hear stuff on the media about houses, and you get these people ringing in and saying, I can't make the equation work. I can't get the rent to pay for my outgoings. Well, no, you can't, because you've borrowed too much. It's a good investment if you have the capital and you get a simple return on your capital, but it's not necessarily a good investment. It's a risky investment if you're borrowing loads of money, as loads of people who bought buy-to-let accommodation found out in the last crash. No, there is a role, therefore, for institutions who borrow money in terms of equity off the capital markets and put it into housing. The market will drive that. At present, it's probably fair to say that if you had a block of flats, the value of the block of flats as an investment is actually higher than the aggregate value of each flat. That's certainly the case in some parts of Dublin. So there is a market there, and that market will be supplied by institutional investors, and that's coming. We need to be aware of that, and I think we need to foster it in the future. Excuse me. So I think that spending time defining this problem suggests a couple of things. One is the paradigm has changed. I don't think we sufficiently realise the implications of that. It has changed. Policies driven by 20th century thinking are not going to solve the problem that we have in the 21st century. I think that's something we need to reflect on. I think government policy should in fact reflect on and should be driven about driving down house prices, not driving up house prices. House prices are too high. People who have to borrow 3.5 times their income to buy a house, there is a problem there. There is a risk there. And I think that's quite important. I think also the idea of capturing increases in land value, which are driven by high house prices, through Part 5 development levies, they require that phenomenon, that model of planning requires prices to be high, which is one of the reasons why the government don't want to bring down house prices. And I think we need to think about that, because that goes to that distinction I made between the cost of producing a house and the cost of building a house. We should try and find a way to make the cost of a house, the price of a house paid in the market, closer to the cost of building a house than it is at the present time. But that needs better land management processes. We need to have a look at our planning systems and how we bring forward land for development, which at the present does it in such a way that it requires the price to be very high. We can't have that going on to the future. And of course, we still need the social net, because if you look at any economy in the world, there's always people who are at the bottom end of the income levels who cannot afford, out of their own resources, to fund their own housing. And that's an inevitable part of every economy. And what we've got to do, therefore, is see that forever in the future, we are going to have a need to provide social housing. It should be seen as part of the social infrastructure, the infrastructure of the state. Just the way we have schools and we have hospitals and we have roads, we need a certain level of social housing. And I think the government underestimate the level of social housing that we will require and always will require. It should be of the order of probably 8 to 10% of the housing stock permanently given to social housing. And that has to be provided by the state. The market will not solve that problem, and if we do go down the road as we have of trying to get the market to solve that problem, we end up with a situation where we just drive up rents. And effectively, as the economists will put it, you subsidising the private rental sector, or subsidising people in the private rental sector, effectively crowds out the market, and the government need to reflect on that. I think they should really try and tackle the housing market from the bottom up, not the top down. And I think this idea of achieving mixed communities using Part 5 is actually a barrier to supply, because it increases the price of houses that can be supplied into the market. It is much more important to directly employ builders and continue that through recessions as a counter-cyclical measure, because if we've learned anything from the last period, what happened to our construction industry in face of a crash, which was very large, albeit we've had large crashes in before, what happened to our construction industry is it was deconstructed. Now, in the 1970s, we had a recession, 1973, 74, 75, when we not quite the same level of economic distress, but we had fairly severe economic distress. But the distinction that you could look at between that period and the period we just come through was that the state kept building through the 1970 recession, so that when the recession ended in 78, 79, there was a construction industry there ready and able to supply buildings into the market when the market took off. That industry went, and it went because there wasn't the social housing provision by the state. So, at a construction summit, I would say, in the end, that, look, you've got to let builders build and make profits out of building, not make profits out of developing land. Developing land profits is a speculative venture, and it can only be really profitable if house prices are very high. It'd be better for us all if we got house prices down. There you are. There's the last quote from Einstein. You can read that. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results, is insanity, and I think we're approaching that in our government at the moment. So thank you very much.